I am thrilled to have the chance to share about how the creation of Chinese Christian posters in the last century might help us better understand some of the dynamics of the media revolution that we're living through in this century with the birth of social media. But before I get into that, I want to just pause and really thank our hosts for this evening, Reframe Ministries. It has been an extraordinary pleasure to work with such a professional group of people, Jerry Ahn, Heather Hevman, Jackson Tong, and then, of course, Katrina Smith have all done a fantastic job in putting this together. Also, recovering 20 of these posters. I can tell you, having spent 8 years on this project, to find 20 posters is an extraordinary find. And then to be able to have them restored and on display like this is just fabulous. So thank you so much for putting this all together, inviting us together tonight, and then allowing me the privilege of trying to put these posters into a larger context. And I first stumbled into the posters about 8 years ago. I'd been speaking at a church and a woman came up and she said, "I need your help." After I had finished talking, she said, "I just found a chest in my grandmother's, who had just passed away, in my grandmother's attic filled with posters, and I don't know what to do with them." And as she was describing them, I was thinking, posters, what are you talking about? And vaguely, I started thinking of some of those photos that we just saw that maybe I'd seen in some archives before, but I'd never seen them in real life. But once I did, I was captivated. I mean, the colors are so bright and striking. I was just immediately pulled in. And I've then spent the next 8 years of my life contacting libraries and archives, personal collectors, organizations like Reframe Ministries, and have been able to amass now 800 posters. They've been digitized, and you can see them online at ChineseChristianPosters.com. It's actually ccposters.com is the web address. But if you type in Chinese Christian posters, you can find all of these. They've all been transliterated into simplified Chinese and tagged. So if you're really interested in pictures of the Bible, you can type that in, or women or children, whatever it might be. So it's available for you to enjoy. So I've been immersed in this for a while, but I've been excited about the particular challenge I was given this evening, which was to think about how these posters from 100 years ago might help us think more strategically about media ministry today. And so I have tried to come up with some ideas about that, and I think there's some interesting parallels between the explosion of Chinese Christian posters and now the expansion of social media in our moment. And so let's dig into that. In 1920, 29 years prior to the Communist Revolution, and several decades before the Cultural Revolution, China experienced a quieter revolution. It witnessed a transformation in print material. A 4-color offset lithography press began operating in Shanghai in 1920. And for the first time, metal plates stamped out bright, colorful prints. Now, on the one hand, this changed absolutely nothing. China had a long history of print technology. I mean, they invented it. So this machine did not usher in something wildly new and completely unimagined. On the other hand, the metal plates used on this machine did not wear down like traditional wood blocks, and the lithography press could crank out tens or even hundreds of thousands of posters at a relative pittance. So this was not a media revolution in terms of product, but in terms of presence. China, in the second quarter of the 20th century, was suddenly awash in new, colorful, and arresting images. And scholars have recognized this and have focused on the explosion of propaganda poster in this time period between, say, 1920 and 1950. And they've paid great attention to things like the political propaganda, but also advertisement propaganda, the emergence of new advertisement culture, and especially advertisement calendars like this that have proliferated in the second quarter of the 20th century, because no other print material was produced on the same scale. I mean, despite the social, economic, political, and even military chaos of China in this time period, companies still managed to print and send out about 20 million of these calendar posters every year. And they were hung up in homes and offices and really anywhere that just needed a splash of color. They became sort of this new profusion of popular beauty. And China had never seen so many mass-produced images before. Now, Christian features actually share many of the same features as these advertisement posters. They've got sort of the fake silk border, maybe couplets on the edge. The description down here is usually where to get the product if you want these cigarettes. This is the description of where to get the product. You go to church and you read the Bible. So, there's a lot of parallels between these, but the Christian posters were never printed on quite the same scale as the calendar posters. The Religious Tract Society, for instance, whose records are the most complete, reports printing only 150,000 posters a year. Nonetheless, a comparison with the secular calendar posters may not be entirely ridiculous either. The Tract Society, after all, printed an additional 1.5 million black and white tract-size versions of all of their posters. And they were just one of a score of publishing houses that were cranking out posters year after year after year. So Christian posters may not have surpassed the massive quantity of popular calendar posters that advertise products like soap and cigarettes. However, when we add it all up, they really were not that far behind either. Christian posters were central players in China's visual revolution, and they competed aggressively and on a grand scale for the eyes and the attention of Chinese viewers. This evening, I'm inviting us to consider the sudden and explosive production of Chinese posters and how that printing revolution from 100 years ago might be able to teach us something about the power and peril of the digital revolution today. As an outline, and how I hope to do that, I'm going to explore 4 themes: speed, new communities and dangerous echo chambers, influencers, and popular theology. Let's begin with speed. Arguably, the most obvious feature of social media is its speed. An event like the assassination attempt on Donald Trump or a bombing in Palestine can be live streamed. We can see events unfolding around the world in real time. There's absolutely no need to wait for the 6 o'clock news any longer. Likewise, commentary is virtually instantaneous. Social media not only allows us to like or add a comment about anything that's happening, but it also invites anyone with a connection to the internet to respond to current events by creating their own new content to what's going on. News has never come faster, been more accessible, or generated and commented upon by a larger audience. Social media has changed the way we interact with current events. Something similar can be said about the advent of Chinese posters. For example, in 1926, the big news was that the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party briefly teamed up to defeat regional warlords to recreate a unified China. And as the army marched north behind a phalanx of pamphleteers, the General Secretary of the Religious Tract Society watched with sort of a mixture of admiration and frustration. "They are using our means and improving upon them," he reported. "Why can't Christians be as creative as these folks to win the hearts of the Chinese people?" He issued a plea to all believers: do propaganda work for your Lord and Master. Shortly thereafter, the National Christian Council of China answered the call and sent out posters to the roughly 1/3 of all Protestant churches in China that were under its umbrella. Arriving in stacks of 100, these were not posters that were to be hung up in a sanctuary or discussed in a Sunday school classroom. The bottom of the poster, relevant to the larger theme of the conference this week about public theology, said it very clearly: please hang in a public space. You can see Christians were co-opting what the nationalist and later communist posters did. But they made Jesus the revolutionary. He was the one liberating China. And as it said on the poster, it is he who establishes a new China. Now, this kind of political commentary was not limited to a few Christians or a few organizations with massive financial resources. Even seminary students, who have always been as poor as church mice, were able to participate in the production of these kind of posters. The Tianjin Bible Seminary, for instance, held an annual poster-making contest for its students, and the winner's poster would be sent to print. Now, in this poster, a student countered nationalist and communist propaganda that the nation was weak and ruined by its many warlords or Western imperialists. By presenting the conflict in larger and more cosmic terms, China was under the control, as it says here, of Satan. Swapping one political ruler for another or closing down foreign factories was not going to solve China's fundamental problem. According to this poster, to slay the prowling lion, Christians needed Jesus. But what kind of Jesus would save China was subject to change. When the nationalists were using the army to unite China, Jesus, as we saw earlier, was portrayed as commanding a troop of evangelists. Later, however, when the communists began to win the hearts of the peasants and proletariats, Christians pivoted. The speed of poster printing made it possible to repackage the Savior. He was no longer the generalissimo, high and above his minions, but Jesus was presented as a carpenter, a working class guy whose friends were fishermen, farmers, and factory workers. Chinese Christian posters, like contemporary social media, were nimble and allowed Christians to respond almost instantaneously to current events. Unlike books that required expertise and could take years to research, write, and print, posters could respond to the moment and gave many Christians a public way to participate in China's search for national salvation. Now I want to talk about new communities and these dangerous echo chambers. Social media has created new communities. I mean, you can find people with common interests on almost any topic. You can find groups for people who love quilting and kayaking or taking photos of grasshoppers. On one hand, social media has created just remarkable links between people and groups that you would never think would have a connection. A New York City civil rights lawyer and a rural sheriff in Idaho might have the joy of discovering, you mean you like taking pictures of grasshoppers too? I've found this on Facebook. On the other hand, the 2024 presidential election cycle reminds us that the United States is deeply divided. The word we often hear is polarized, and one of the factors contributing to the division is the way social media's algorithms have sorted us into what are called echo chambers. We only listen to and read the ideas and the opinions that are similar to our own. Time and again, studies of social media have ended up with graphics like this one from an earlier election cycle, and it shows who follows and retweets whom. It turns out we follow and repost almost exclusively the opinions of those we like. We have virtually no intersection with the other side, except perhaps to glean the most wild and crazy statements we can find that we will repost to incite anger among people who share our ideas. So social media is really the proverbial two-edged sword. It's created unlikely bedfellows, bringing people together whom you would never expect, but it also cuts us off from people who see the world differently. And we can find similar dynamics in Christian posters already 100 years ago. For instance, they reveal unexpected affinities. Listen, if you know nothing else about modernism and fundamentalism in the first half of the 20th century, you at least probably know this. The two sides didn't like each other, right? Fundamentalists called modernists apostates who had been duped by Satan. And modernists, meanwhile, despised fundamentalists and accused them of being fossil-like, moss-backed, and narrow-minded. The rift in China was so deep that the two groups developed separate institutions, separate journals, separate summer retreats, everything. They literally seemed to find no common ground between them. At least that's what we've always assumed based on the written record. But the visual record tells us a completely different story. In fact, it's shocking to discover that if we only had posters, we would have assumed that fundamentalism and modernism never reached China's shores. Because the fact is, visually speaking, the two were virtually identical. Despite what you might think, fundamentalists and modernists in China presented the Bible in their posters in the same terms. And this is shocking, really. The Bible is exactly what the two sides were fighting over. Modernists insisted that the Bible had to be interpreted in light of contemporary insights that had been gleaned from hard and soft sciences. Fundamentalists, they feared, were making the Bible irrelevant to contemporary society. And meanwhile, fundamentalists insisted that to sift the biblical truth through a sieve of geology or biology or psychology was just to create an idol. They charged modernists with worshiping a God diminished to the size of their own reason and science. They were worshiping their own God rather than the God of Scripture. So the flashpoints in this debate between the two sides were reduced to predictable lists: the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, miracles, the resurrection. I mean, look, wherever the supernatural appeared in the Bible, that's where the modernists and the fundamentalists would gather. That's where the fight was going to happen. You would think, therefore, that fundamentalist posters at least would emphasize the Bible's stories of the miraculous. But they didn't. In fact, both fundamentalists and modernists produced very few posters that were about biblical stories. And when they did, they were overwhelmingly about parables, as you can see when you walk out here this evening. A comparison with Roman Catholic posters, to which we'll return momentarily, is useful. I've tracked down 67 Catholic posters based on New Testament stories, and only 6 Catholic posters illustrate a parable. The others focus on the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The emphasis of Protestant posters is inverted. 16 posters capture a story about Jesus, about his life, while 56 posters showcase one of the stories told by Jesus. I think this is important because parables do not feature supernatural elements. Jesus relished in the daily life of things, about a woman working yeast into dough or a gardener trying to make a tree grow. The Protestant proclivity for parables made debates about God violating natural laws simply irrelevant because miracles were absent. Even when Protestants dared to depict a scene from the life of Jesus, both modernists and fundamentalists minimized the miraculous. Let's just take the virgin birth as an example. This was a point of intense controversy between Protestants, but only Catholic posters like this one disturbed the scene with supernatural actors. The conservative, fundamentalist religious tract society's naturalism, by contrast, may be the poster's most sort of distinctive feature. And the more liberal Anglican Church in China's publishing house only alludes vaguely to unusual events by featuring one star just a little bit larger than the others. Fundamentalists and modernists both downplayed the life of Jesus because of its high concentration of miracles, in favor of highlighting Jesus' teaching. They turned Jesus into a moral guide. Stop doing evil and learn to do good is how this poster summarized the message of the prodigal son. It's unknown if this comes from a fundamentalist or a modernist printing press, but that's what makes it so interesting. The content gives us no clue because stop doing evil and learn to do good is a synopsis that could appear on virtually any Protestant poster that features a story from the Bible. For despite all their vitriol, when it came to their visual messages, fundamentalists and modernists both chose to communicate that morals, not miracles, were the key to salvation. Now, Roman Catholic posters, as we've already seen, relished in the miraculous. But that's not the only thing that pushed them apart from Protestants in China. Protestants and Catholics ended up in different echo chambers because they held opposing visions of China's pathway to renewal. Celso Constantini, who had the rank of archbishop, arrived in China in 1922 with an agenda. He was going to indigenize Christianity. That is, he was going to make it less European and more Chinese. He managed to build a remarkable team of artists, most of whom converted to the Catholic faith while painting and teaching Christian artwork at Furen University, the Catholic university in Beijing. These artists consciously worked to express Christianity in Chinese idioms. And I want to thank the artist and scholar He Qi for his chapter in this book for helping me to see how these Furen artists used, for instance, traditional Chinese brushstrokes and incorporated Chinese artistic devices. Here, for instance, you can see how Catholic artists were copying sort of the famous Ma Yuan from the 13th century, who liked to paint a dense amount of activity in one corner and counterbalance it with sort of an evocative emptiness in the other corner. And of course, Catholic posters are doing the same here. Or they might take a deity like Guanyin, who we'll see here, and use her iconography to express the compassion and tenderness of Mary. Right? Just an incredible parallel between the two. Or, we might also move the scenery from the Bible to China. Here we are actually witnessing a less than frantic escape to Egypt in the life of Jesus, as he serenely coasts away on what appears to be a Chinese lake, which presumably will never reach the shores of Egypt. But that's not the point, right? The point is that Jesus now belongs to China. Or we might also see something like this in a Catholic poster where you have a very rural scene with Chinese shepherds coming to visit the Savior. And they are so Chinese that the new mother even drapes her head in a white cloth in traditional fashion after the birth of her child. So you have this sense that this is becoming very Chinese. And Constantini rejoiced as these works were painted and then printed onto posters, believing they inaugurated a new Catholic Chinese style, one that expressed the Christian faith in traditional Chinese visual terms. Yet, as Stephanie Wong has pointed out again in this book, this embrace of tradition or traditional Chinese practices cut Catholics off from larger conversations. I mean, sure, their posters upheld traditional values like filial piety. Here Jesus is obediently serving his Father. But the problem was not so much filial piety, but the very culture it represented. This traditional Chinese culture was under attack in many corners in China in the first half of the 20th century. Some people in China simply didn't want the old culture anymore. Having bound feet like the woman here in the top right corner, was no longer being seen as a sign of beauty, but was increasingly becoming a sign of national disgrace. Or the Chinese traditional robe, which you see here in the top left corner, in this Protestant poster, I should add, is starting to be associated in many corners with backwardness, dirtiness, filthiness, disgust. Whereas a Western suit is not really a sign of Westernization in this poster as much as a sign of modernization. This is going to be something new. And ultimately, that's what kept Catholic and Protestant posters in separate echo chambers. Catholic images communicated the biblical message: God restores all things. Their posters look to the future by way of the past. The fortunes of Zion will be restored, right? That's sort of the Catholic vision. Whereas the Protestants blanketed China with a different biblical word: God makes all things new. And their posters displayed dramatic breaks with the past, as they declared, see, God is doing a new thing. Of course, there were other factors that kept Catholics and Protestants apart. But I think visually, they moved in separate spheres because each side could only imagine China's salvation in their own chosen terms. And both sides had plenty of likes, plenty of reinforcement from various people in China who preferred one vision over the other. However, that very process of reinforcement only entrenched Catholics and Protestants in their particular messaging and precluded them from seeing the gospel truth being communicated by the other side. Posters, you see, prefigured the very dynamics of our contemporary social media. They brought people together whom we would not have expected. I mean, modernists and fundamentalists? Come on, who would have thought? But they also divided Christians, polarizing Catholics and Protestants by playing to their particular preferences. Now let's talk about influencers. A relatively new phenomenon in social media is the emergence of influencers. They are people who have online posts and who have credibility with their audience. So you have someone like Ami Song, who might say something about the new dress she wore, how comfortable it is and how low maintenance it is, and suddenly sales of that dress will spike. Or you'll have someone like Alex Stoll, who will give you a picture of his most recent trip in the Andes Mountains, and suddenly there'll be a surge of tickets to Peru that are being purchased. And advertisers have noticed this effect, and so they've begun to pay influencers to mention their products and travel destinations. I mean, last year, almost $35 billion was funneled to these influencers. And that's already about 5 times more than went to influencers in just 2019. I mean, this is taking off. Influencers have become important directors of our desires. And I've chosen those words carefully, directors of our desires, because Chinese posters from last century demonstrate that influencers actually have minimal success in creating desires. They cannot tap into something that's not already there. But if there's already a kind of desire swirling about in their audience, then influencers can channel that desire and offer their viewers an answer for their appetites. Let me illustrate. As I mentioned before, Christians were not the only ones producing posters in China. They were not the only, if I can use the term, influencers getting their messages out. The communists famously produced many propaganda posters. In fact, we believe that's one of the reasons they were ultimately successful in winning the nation. However, we must remember that any success that the communists had only came after they accommodated their audience's tastes. The fact is, their first years of poster making was an abysmal failure. In their early years, communists and other traditional radicals found black and white prints, were a dramatic way to capture the bleak conditions that Chinese peasants and working class people had to live through. So with great zeal, they spread posters like this one throughout the countryside. But they discovered that actually peasants weren't interested in this poster. They just sort of scratched their heads thinking, there's a lot of emotion here, but I don't know what's going on. It's just sort of confusing. And I certainly don't want to bring that much anger to hang into my house. And most damning of all, they said, it's just boring. I mean, it's black and white. There's no color here. It's not going to beautify the house. And so they were actually an incredible failure as they tried to impose what they wanted on an audience through prints like this. The Nationalist Party, which controlled China at the time, also printed posters. And they smartly chose to invest in color. Right? Oh, so much more lively and beautiful with the color. But it turns out color alone is not sufficient. Their messages failed to tap into their audience's wants because there really isn't much of a market for posters that instruct you to walk on the left side of the sidewalk or make straight lines or find something to do if you don't have anything to do. The nationalists wanted to modify the behavior of China's citizens, but an influencer's desire doesn't move the masses. It's the audience's desire that matters. In that sense, Christian posters had a head start on both communist and nationalist propaganda. Unlike the parties who were constrained by ideological purity and the need to impose what they wanted on China, Christian posters were designed to sell. The massive uptick in Christian production coincided with the worldwide Great Depression. Suddenly, Christian publishing houses were faced with a financial shortfall. All their foreign support dried up, and they needed something that could cover the gap. And they found that in posters. Notice, though, that their influence was then dictated by the market. What did consumers want? Did they want the flames of hell? Or was that a little bit too much? Did they need to turn down the heat a little bit? You know, it didn't matter. They would sell it to you either way. These marketers or these publishing houses, these Christian poster makers, could be responsive to the market in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. They were influencers, but only because they willingly adapted their message to the market. They gave Chinese people what they wanted. So that leads me to popular theology. What did people want? Christian posters give us a great indication. They let us see what Chinese, let me say that again, Chinese Christian artists believed would be compelling to their compatriots. For the moment then, let's turn aside from what has been written by Chinese theologians about the gospel in their books, which, after all, very few people ever read. Instead, we're going to focus our attention on the good news that reached the general populace through the millions of posters that hung on city walls and temple gates, that were put up in tea rooms, as we saw earlier, or just unfolded for street evangelism. These pictures were by far the most public display of Christianity in China. So what did they say to the general populace? How did they appeal to the Chinese interests and appetites? We find that Protestant posters were actually thoughtfully crafted to address multiple desires to the average man or woman on the street, including how Christianity could improve labor conditions, or how it could help get their children access to modern education, or provide protection from common illnesses, and of course, allow them to escape the terrors of hell and enter the joys of heaven. However, the most common theme of Christian posters was undeniably the cross of Jesus Christ. Apparently, no other object, person, symbol, or text communicated the gospel more clearly than the cross. Not even Jesus himself, who, surprisingly, is almost entirely absent among the 800 posters I've found. I've already shown you almost all the Jesus posters I have tonight, just to put that in perspective. It was the cross that became the highly condensed symbol that could speak to the desires of China's millions. But why was that? What did the cross say? Well, first, we need to recognize that the cross came to substitute for Jesus and his presence. In this poster, for example, we see the cross illuminating a dark scene, and one unfortunate young man has his back turned to the light and so is scratching his head in confusion as he can't make sense of the gospel, whereas this man has turned toward the cross and the light and is able to read and understand and absorb the word of God. Now, for those of us familiar with the Bible, this is rich with allusions. I mean, it makes us think of John chapter 1, verse 5, where the light has come into the world, but the world has not understood it. However, for anyone who comes into the light, there is eternal life in John chapter 3, verses 18 to 21. And if you could read this down at the very bottom, in case you've missed it, it says, I am the light, is the title of the poster from John 8, verse 12. But let's be honest, Jesus isn't in this poster. In his place stands a red cross. It is the light of the world. I want to pause here for a moment because I've talked about the posters enough that I know there's someone here tonight who's thinking, well, Daryl, it's no big deal. Protestants never put Jesus on the cross because Jesus is risen from the dead. We wouldn't expect to see him there. That's true, but that's not my point. My point is Chinese artists never or hardly ever painted Jesus at all. And like in this poster, the words are from John chapter 8. Well, Jesus was very much alive. There is no need to paint a crucified Christ here. They just removed Jesus and put the cross in his place. The cross apparently was believed to be a better ambassador of the gospel. So why was that? What was the cross's good news? Well, I think there are several things, and you can, again, one more plug, read about it here in the book, but I'm going to just focus on two tonight. First, I think the cross was important because it is strong. It offered stability in the midst of a chaotic world. I mean, just look at the size of this cross. It's actually larger than the entire globe, right? It's huge. It conveys something of strength. Or consider this cross. I mean, it's so massive, it's clearly not for crucifixion. These poor guys couldn't have their arms stretched across the bars of that cross. I'm not even sure their arms can get across the clock face. I mean, the thing is massive, and it fills the entire poster, top to bottom, left to right. The idea is that the cross is big, it's solid, it's strong. And probably no poster captures that better than this one right here. I mean, look at that monster. I mean, the thickness of that thing is incredible. And it's not brown like wood or even red, the popular color for blessing. It's blue and silver, more reminiscent of those powerful modern machines like the locomotive or the gunboat. The cross is unshakable. And to Chinese viewers in the first half of the 20th century, that meant a lot. In fact, it might have meant just about everything. Imagine this. Right when Christian posters started to print in 1920, 1921, there was a massive famine that pushed 20 to 30 million Chinese people to the point of starvation and actually swallowed the lives of 500,000 people. And then just 10 years later, in 1931, floods forced 52 million people to flee for their lives. 52 million people. while 2 million actually drowned in the fast-rising water. And in between those two catastrophic natural disasters, China endured a dozen civil wars, withered under crippling economic sanctions, was devastated by the worldwide Great Depression, and then watched helplessly as Japan annexed Manchuria. That's just the 1920s up to the beginning of the 1930s. The following decade was arguably worse, as the nationalist and communist armies turned regional conflicts into a national battle, and then the invasion of the Japanese into the rest of China in 1937 turned a national battle into a world war. I'm telling you, China in the heyday of poster prints was a country teetering on the brink of an abyss. So it's no wonder viewers felt like they needed something strong to hold on to. And time and again, posters offered precisely that. The cross is a firm anchor. It is the one thing you can count on in a tumultuous and dangerous world. If that isn't enough, then people might also embrace the cross because it was a gateway to abundant life. You might think that since China was awash in trauma and tragedy, that artists might turn to the cross for solace and comfort like other artists had done for centuries. This painting was originally hung in a hospital in Germany, reminding patients that Jesus is a man of sorrows and carries their infirmities and sickness. But Chinese artists didn't use the cross for that purpose. Instead, they used it to communicate blessing. In fact, that is what is written on top of this red cross, in case you might miss the point. The cross became a symbol of new and a better life. Part of this was communicated, of course, by drawing on popular imagery. The cartoon on the left is from a newspaper, very conventional. You would see these regularly in China. Down one road is the road to national destruction if you keep buying foreign products. But if you buy homegrown Chinese-made products, that's the pathway to national renewal and new life. And Christian posters adopted the same thing. I have so many posters of two roads, and they're always divided by a cross. And down one road, if you choose, life is going to be hard. I mean, look at this windy road and the uneven stones. You've even got a viper you've got to contend with here. And the destination is not desirable, folks. Like, this is not an easy road. But if you here at the cross choose the other way, look how smooth and straight that road is. I mean, it is clear sailing. I love how these people don't even have to look where they're going. They're just strolling on their way to heaven, reading their Bibles. This is an easier life. Or you can see the promise of an easier life here. If you pass through the gate here on this poster, you can leave your sins behind, it says. Or in other posters, it actually says you can leave your troubles behind. Or on a poster like this, you see the importance of the cross because you have this poor woman, she's dragged down by her guilt or her sin. But if she can just get to the cross, she's freed from all that and can walk into abundant life. What I find interesting about all of these posters is that none of them refer to Jesus' words to take up your cross daily and follow me. They always leave the cross behind. Because this cross is not a way to offer you comfort in your suffering, but an escape from it. Or to say it more positively, the cross in China promised viewers a better life and not merely a way to endure it. Because the cross became the central icon of Protestant Christianity, it received special communist censure. In 1951, the last year Christian posters were produced, the cross was dramatically reduced in size. So it only marks a building as a Christian church here, or these energetic young youth as Christians, but really has no more theological significance than that. It was drained of its power under communist control. That doesn't mean, however, that Chinese Protestants have forgotten the cross. In fact, it's still extraordinarily meaningful. And that's why I would argue that despite the many and various challenges that Chinese Christians continue to face today, what seems to mobilize them the most is when crosses are removed from their churches. That, more than anything else, is seen as something that's crossed the line, what's directly been an assault on their faith. In fact, in Huai'an, the church became so tired of the state removing the church and then putting it back and then having it taken down again, they finally built the cross right into the church. Try removing that. Right? Why go to such lengths? Because Chinese popular theology, born from these posters, is not so much Christocentric as it is crucicentric. It's the cross that came to symbolize true salvation. Well, there you go. 4 quick links between Chinese Christian posters and social media. Speed, able to respond to contemporary events, new communities, bringing people together that you wouldn't expect, but also the dangerous echo chamber. The influencers and really the limitations that influencers have. They're dictated by the market, which leads to the power of popular theology. What do people really want to hear? So what might we, and I'm thinking of all of us generally, but also Reframe Ministries in particular, what might we glean from this quick historical overview? How might it shape the way we engage in social media today? I have 3 quick suggestions. First, social media empowers us to speak good news to this moment. Our gospel is not just a series of historical events that happened millennia ago. It is more like what C.S. Lewis pictured in the Chronicles of Narnia. Jesus' death and resurrection is a pivot in history. Now death works backward, he wrote. God's redemptive work is spreading, perhaps often in secret and invisibly, but nonetheless, God is undoing sin and death. Social media invites us to witness to that reality right now, even if we only see God's work as if in a mirror and darkly. And of course, that requires courage and humility, but we can share the good news of God in the midst of current events, concerns, and longings. Second, we must be alert to the feedback mechanisms built into social media and the way their algorithms can cut us off from the very people we are trying to reach. If we rank our effectiveness by likes, hearts, and the number of times our posts are reposted, we are probably not reaching the people that we wish to with the good news. Almost certainly, we are merely hearing amens from people who have already embraced the gospel. So we have to be alert to the trap of echo chambers and do the hard work of building connections with others whose outlooks, religious commitments, and ideologies are very different than our own. And I know that will not be easy. In fact, the system is biased against it. Nonetheless, social media does have the power to surprise us, and it is possible to build new communities, but it requires determination. And third, we need to always remember that what we post matters. I'm not saying that every post needs to be perfect. That would be impossible and just plain paralyzing. What I am referring to is to the steady stream of output, drip by drip, post by post, or might I say, poster by poster. A particular picture of the gospel is formed, and we need to be intentional about that. Taken as a whole, is our output narrowing the gospel, or is it expressing how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ Jesus? If history can be our guide, then I think we need to pay attention to Christian posters because they still invite us to look and have so much to teach us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I knew nothing about this. This lecture dropped into a pool of ignorance. Before tonight. So these are completely off the top of the head comments. What I would be able to say a month from now is probably quite different from what I'll have to say tonight. I have no idea how this, or very little idea as to how this art fits into the history of Chinese art. There was, of course, a long history, 3 centuries, of graphic art in China, woodcuts and so forth. And this has to be not entirely unrelated to that. So that'd be interesting to know how it fits into that tradition. But I don't know enough about that to say anything about it. So I'm just going to offer some reflections by way of contrast with Western art. What strikes me about this art, and what you emphasized, and what strikes anyone, is that this is religious art that was public. Public in the sense that it was widely shared by the public. Tens of thousands of people bought copies of these posters and displayed them in their homes, places of work, on the street, and so forth. So this is art in the general public. And thereby, being these tens of thousands of identical posters posted all over the place, a certain religious unity was created. And that strikes me as probably an important part of how they actually worked. For us in the modern West, almost the only shared public art in the same sense is commercial art. Our copies of the same magazine show up in our mailboxes and we look at them and we share commercial art. I sat wondering, do we share is there shared public religious art? The best I can come with is shared commercial art, shared religious commercial art. I subscribe to Christianity Today and to Christian Century, and there are ads, pictorial ads in there, and they're almost all for seminaries or for books to buy. They don't show Jesus, they don't show the cross, they're religious commerce. So let's face it, shared public art in the modern West is almost entirely commercial art. That says something about us. A certain commercial unity is created instead of a religious unity. We all desire the same products. For the most part, religious art in the West has been art that is not in that same sense shared, but reflect back on it. Religious art in the West has mainly been art that you have to go to see. The Byzantine icons, you had to go to the church to see them. The medieval altarpieces, you had to go to the church to see them. The medieval capitals in the medieval cathedrals, you had to go to the church to see them. It was art that you had to go to. These Chinese posters, to make the point again, were different. You didn't have to go somewhere to see them. In effect, they came to you. They were right there in your home, on the street, in the business, and so forth. So I've been thinking, is there any close analog in the West to this sort of shared religious art? I think the closest analog, but it's pretty distant, is the graphic art of the Renaissance. Dürer's etchings and engravings, Rembrandt's etchings and engravings, Schongauer's etchings and engravings. Those were shared, people shared them, but given the medium of woodcut and engraving and so forth, the plates wore down rather quickly, and you couldn't, at most, you could print 200 copies, whereas some of these had 100,000 copies. So that's a pretty pale analog, right? A very pale analog. So they were, in a way, public, but the public was much smaller. And my guess, I don't know, is that you had to have more money to buy a Dürer or a Rembrandt print than you had to buy a Chinese poster. When I was thinking about all this, I was reminded, however, of graffiti art in Northern Ireland. I've got 3 books here. You can leaf through them afterwards. If you go through Belfast, still today, but certainly 20 years ago, what you would see is massive arrays of graffiti art on the walls of the buildings and so forth. And what was happening there is the Protestants would paint their heroes and episodes and so forth, and the Catholics would paint theirs. And often these would be on the same road, on one side the Catholic, on one side the Protestant. This is extremely public art. You didn't go to see it. It was in your face. And given the religiosity of the struggle in Northern Ireland, it was, in a way, pagan religious art. Feel free to leaf through them. I think it's also worth reflecting on the religious content of these Chinese posters. The altarpieces in the Catholic West and the icons in the Byzantine East were intended as objects of devotion. People bowed before them, lit candles before them, and so forth. As I understand these Chinese posters, they were not intended, though they could be, not usually anyway, not primarily, as objects of religious devotion. They were teachings, reminders. They were teaching the gospel, or parts of the gospel, in pictorially rather than in print. Their function was to teach and to remind, though they could be used devotionally. Let me stop there. It's a fascinating development. It made me think, was some youngish person ought to set the project of writing a comprehensive story of Christian art in the world and how similar and different, what's distinctive about these Chinese posters, what was distinctive about the Dürer Rembrandt prints, and so forth. Thanks.
Thanks to Daryl for his wonderfully provocative presentation. And I am also thankful for this opportunity to join the precious moment, even though to do it via Zoom. These Christian posters, historians, we tend to prioritize written records, provide fresh venues of history for new insights. These tangible objects help nuance our understanding of the crowded public space. Now, Republican China was not just a battlefield between the nationalists and the communists. Christianity actually had an active and lasting presence in appealing to a broad audience. And for that, as Daryl rightly points out, these posters are perhaps our closest guide to popular Christianity in early 20th century China. What the message about Christianity were being put on the streets and how they were construed. And out of his 4 themes, 2 really got me thinking. The wise words against the dangers of echo chambers are certainly warranted. Meanwhile, that the vast majority of Protestant posters, it doesn't matter if they're fundamentalist or modernist in sources, avoid miracles, and they pivot for moral instruction. This is very revealing and perhaps alarming. It's inherently difficult, of course, for posters to convey doctrinal subtleties. Yet the silence, I think, is already making a vocal statement that the popular message of Christianity was perhaps arrested by a larger and more entrenched narrative of the power of moral edification. Its Confucian roots are ancient and is greatly empowered when this message of moral edification was grafted onto the national narrative, that is, moral reform to save the nation. You are, of course, welcome to read the book for further analysis, but let me just say this here. Paul would have something different and difficult to say in his letters to the Galatians on the relationship between law, morality, and grace. My second reflection is on the theme of popular theology. If you've heard of this claim that popular Chinese theology is not Christ-centric, but cross-centric, we've just seen strong evidence this evening. As a scholar, I'm much intrigued by this phenomenon. Yet as a Chinese Christian, I am again alarmed. The cross, however central to the redemptive history, is not its entirety, and not even the entirety of the Christ event. It limits our vision to the moment of justification at the cost of sanctification. The latter is a life of daily bearing of our crosses, witnessing the gospel in the public square, rather than making one individual choice to usher in a happier life. When paired up with the motivation for individual moral choice, this cross-centric formula also risks crediting too much agency to human efforts at the cost of God's sovereignty. And it tends to flatten the weight of the future judgment to a ticket to heaven when we die. Again, all in all, how to faithfully share the gospel in a way that is effective and relevant to our time, that would be a perennial challenge. But however tough this fight is, it is a good fight, worth of our time. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Lee. I'm the content manager in China Source. It's a true honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity. And thank you, Dr. Daryl Ireland, for this fascinating speech. So like Jerry said, last year, China Source had the privilege to host an event at Wheaton College featuring Dr. Ireland's fascinating research and his book release, Visions of Salvation. And we've already learned so much from last year's event about his about Chinese Christian history and his unique take on social media phenomena. And today's lecture just further enrich our understanding on these topics. Thank you again. I'm really excited here. So I really think that your perspective on the interplay of media, religion, and society are both timely and thought-provoking. So as I reflect on tonight's lecture, several key points stand out to me. I just want to focus on 2 points to make it short. So firstly, I'm so intrigued by Dr. Ireland's mention of how these posters create new communities and at times dangerous echo chambers. Just like social media today can both connect and separate us, these posters united Christians across different theological lines while also reinforcing existing biases. This reminds us of the double-edged nature of social media. While it brings us together closer to like-minded individuals and creates communities of shared interests, it also risks isolating us from different perspectives. This isolation can foster echo chambers where our existing beliefs are amplified and rarely challenged, potentially deepening divisions. The visual similarity between modernist and fundamentalist posters, despite their doctrinal differences, reminds us that the core message of faith can bridge our divisions if we let them. It is a sobering reminder that our faith and our use of media should strive to connect rather than separate, to understand rather than judge. This is what we love to see, right? To maintain balance, avoid biases, and foster collaborations and conversations. And yes, it's not easy. It takes courage and humility. Secondly, thinking about how we use social media today, one thing really stands out to me is the speed and immediacy of social media. Dr. Ireland draws an interesting parallel between the rapid spread of Christian posters in the early 20th century and today's digital revolution. Both eras experienced a significant surge in the availability and influence of visual media, shaping how people perceive and engage with the world. This rapid pace allows us to share events, ideas, responses instantly, but it also brings challenges like dealing with misinformation and the superficial nature of quick interactions. Eye-catching visuals and brief posts can sometimes overshadow deeper, more meaningful engagement with the gospel message. And massive and overwhelming information also requires more of the discernment as well. So here's the question I want to leave with you tonight. How can we, as Chinese Christians, leverage social media's speed and reach to share the enduring and transformative power of the gospel without falling into the traps of fleeting trends and misleading appearances? In my opinion, we should strive to use social media to share our authentic, life-changing truths while building genuine connections and thoughtful dialogue. Reflecting on tonight's presentation, it's evident that the historical use of visual media of evangelism and social commentary has much to teach us about our digital engagements today. The lessons from these posters encourage us to be mindful of how we use our platforms, striving for authenticity, fostering genuine connections, and always pointing back to our core truths of our faith. And that's what China Source aims to do. Once again, I want to thank you, Dr. Daryl Ireland, for this rich knowledge and profound insights. Your work not just helps us to understand more about the past and also navigate how we navigate today's complexities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ireland, for this wonderful, insightful, and profound message on Chinese poster research. I'm an elder of a local Chinese Christian church here in Lansing, just 1 hour from here. We are like many Chinese churches in the US. We focus a lot on campus ministry. We shepherd the students from Michigan State University. We have a lot of students from mainland China, from Taiwan, and also from Far East. I know tonight that we all have seen so many fancy Chinese posters carrying so many deep meanings for us to research and ponder. But now I'm going to show you some not so fancy posters. I got some PPT. Okay, thank you. Well, they are also created by Chinese. They are created by the Chinese church here in the United States. But I collect them from the social media like Facebook, Instagram, and WeChat. This kind of a poster should probably be familiar to many of you, and you might have even created some of them, right? Yourself. As you see, they're not so creative, and they're not even trying to contextualize or reflecting today's culture flow. They're nothing like those earlier Chinese posters that Dr. Allen shared with us today. These posters or electronic flyers do not require special art skills. Most churches just use the online template because it's free to reproduce them, to quickly generate them. So this poster are used by the Chinese church in the United States. Many of them are actually the event poster for welcome party because fall semester is approaching. Beginning of the fall semester, we always have the welcome party, and so we use the online free template to generate this poster, and we copy and paste and we share. Very convenient, very quick. And the Chinese church in the US has a very distinct and unique way when it comes to evangelism. First, most of the Chinese church here started as a Bible study group, as you may know. And second, in order for us to grow, these churches need constantly sharing gospel and converting non-believers and making disciples. So we have a tendency of being activity-driven. Lots of activities. Each church or fellowship has her own evangelistic meeting, has their own revival meeting, not mentioning all kinds of retreats in the spring, summer, fall, winter. So we need lots of posters, electronic flyers, of course. And I'm sure with the rise of the generative AI, such as ChatGPT, this poster will soon be created more efficiently. But you see, in modern society, efficiency cannot bring lasting and impactful value. These quick fixes are just like fast food, right? You consume them and then you forget about them. They are so easy to copy and paste and share. But I can't help but imagine if after 100 years, when someone, like us, gather together again in this room and examine these forgettable posters, they're not going to tell the stories. They're not going to, for people to discover special meanings. So perhaps this is the tragedy of our era. So one of the walk away from today's talk, I believe, at least for myself, is to be encouraged and be inspired to make better use of our creativities. And that's what I need to share tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. It's really late. I'm supposed to be the last one, so I will be quick, hopefully. The time is, the year was 1853, September. There was a young man, he went on a ship or go to a boat at that time, and from London and traveled more than almost 6 months and reached to the shore of Shanghai, and the year is 1954, March the 1st. And little did he know he would become one of the most significant figure of the China contemporary mission history, and his name is James Hudson Taylor. It took him almost 6 months to travel, and at that time, he was only 21. And 2 months after he arrived, actually, it was his 22nd birthday. He almost have his birthday on the ship if it took a bit longer. And the funny thing is, we had this discussion with Jamie Taylor, who is his like 5th generation grandson, and about that journey. And in one of his sermons, I just realized he mentioned about this journey and also saying, you know, how long it would take me to travel from here back to London on the plane. The answer is 11 hours and 20 minutes. And the funny thing or interesting reality is we just ask ourselves, are we more willing to take that kind of sacrifice to become missionaries, to travel overseas to the ends of the earth, to become missionaries, or to do the sacrifice, you know, according to the Great Commission of, you know, to the end of the earth, make disciples to the end of the world? So the answer is probably not. Your last comment is that the poster still has so much to teach us today. And I think we can learn still a lot from our forerunners, no matter which era they belong to. In the Bible, in the Acts, there are only 28 chapters. At the end of Acts 28, you only talk about Apostle Paul is willing to go to Rome, probably his final destination. And in other of his letters, he said, I want to go to the end of the earth. At that time, the end of the earth was Spain. And we all know the end of the earth is, there's no end of the earth because you go to Spain, you'll circle around, you'll come back here again. But today, the ends of the earth is different. But it doesn't mean that people or the followers of Christ didn't follow his command to travel to the ends of the earth, near or far, to make disciples everywhere, anywhere. So what I want to say is, in every era, we all have our own stories need to tell. We all have our own stories need to write, and just in very different ways. So I want to end up here with a song, actually, not I composed, I wrote, but I asked AI to write it for us because earlier today, Pastor Cho Jing-er told us there was no song on refugees, gospel music or Christian music on refugees in Chinese. So I asked Sumo to do that, and it took me 30 seconds. And I just want to show you, and it's a beautiful lyrics and only take 1 minute, and the melody is sweet. So there is a Chinese Christian song about refugees. It was composed by me with the help of AI. I just put in 2 keywords. One is grace, another is the love of Christ. Enjoy.
就黑